The cop had his baton raised over my head, warehouse lights shaking above us, and I remember thinking, so this is how I disappear. No sirens, no witnesses, just an old black man on a cold floor nobody was ever meant to see. He leaned in close enough for me to smell the cigarettes on his breath and whispered, "Confess or bleed, old man," like my life was nothing but a box he could tick. And right when I braced for the hit, the metal door blew open and the man the government told me was dead stepped through the dust. My name is Harold Green. I'm 71 years old, and until that night I was just the radio guy in South Ridge, the part of Red Willow people call high risk when they don't want to say black and poor. I fix scanners and old shortwave sets for whoever shows up, cops included, hands shaking a little but still steady enough when there's a circuit that needs saving. In the corner of my living room sits a battered little radio tuned permanently to 67.9, a frequency. I started calling the Dead Man's Channel because too many voices I heard there later showed up as names in stories about incidents with the police. Their files went quiet, but that static kept a piece of them alive. Part of why I hold on so hard goes back to 1971, when I watched a black teenager get shot on Maple Street, heard an officer say, "self-defense," before anyone checked a pulse, and walked home with my mouth shut because I thought silence was the only way to stay alive. That choice has been sitting on my chest ever since. One night not long ago, I was bent over my workbench, that little radio humming in the corner, when the sound changed. The static thinned out and a young white voice cut through, clipped and casual like he'd done this 100 times. "New surveillance target South Ridge. Priority, blacklist updated," he said like he was reading off a grocery list. In Red Willow, blacklist means who gets stopped, who gets searched, who might not make it home. My heart stumbled. Then the line went dead like somebody yanked a plug. Suddenly that radio felt heavy in my hands, like it knew something I wasn't supposed to. I stepped out on the porch with it still warm in my hand and replayed it a few times just to be sure I'd heard what I thought I'd heard. By the time my neighbor Eddie heard it too and shook his head, we both understood exactly what it meant, even if we didn't know whose name was coming next. The very next day, I was in the grocery store staring at the TV over the register. There was Bradford Holloway, local business hero, in a blue tie and a perfect smile, standing beside Police Chief Mills in front of shiny new patrol cars. The caption said, "Donating for public safety," and people around me nodded, talking about what a good man he was, while I thought about that word blacklist and how every time the department gets new toys, our side of town gets more stops and fewer answers. That same afternoon, an internal alert went out that someone in South Ridge had picked up a restricted channel. When my name, Harold Green, landed in that report, it slid across the desk of Officer Brandon Hale. Brandon came from a family of officers who treated South Ridge like enemy territory, not part of their town. He was raised on stories about cleaning up our neighborhood, stories where people who look like me are always the problem to be handled. By the time he put on a uniform, he didn't see neighbors, he saw categories and targets. So when he heard some old black man had touched a restricted channel, he didn't hear a glitch, he heard disrespect. That evening I was walking home with my tool bag when a patrol car rolled up behind me without lights, that slow crawl every black man in town knows. Brandon stepped out, went straight for the radio on my shoulder, asked what I was doing on that frequency, and hit me in the face before I could finish saying I hadn't meant to. He hooded me, tied my wrists, shoved me into the back seat, and after a short directionless ride I was in a warehouse, ropes cutting into my arms under a single swinging bulb. Standing in front of me, he spat between my shoes and asked who told me to stick my nose in white folks' business, then dragged out Maple Street and the boy I'd watched die and the way I'd walked away. The worst part was that he wasn't wrong about that, but for once I didn't fold. I told him my silence had helped kill that kid, and I wasn't staying silent tonight no matter what he did. He raised the baton to crush my skull, and that's when the door exploded open. Cold air rushed in, and a man in a black coat with a familiar scar on his jaw stepped through the dust. It was my son, Sergeant Jalin Green, the same son the government had told me was dead, and he crossed the floor like he'd been in worse rooms than this, took Brandon down in a few practiced moves and pinned him to the concrete. When Brandon tried to act tough, Jalin leaned on his shoulder and told him to name who ordered it, and under that pressure Brandon finally gasped out Holloway's name, admitting the example came from the same man on the TV shaking the chief's hand. Before we left, Jalin took his gun, his badge, and the silver access card on his belt, the kind that opens doors the rest of us never even see. Later, after he got me home, he told me how that access card led him into one of Holloway's buildings and into a server room full of secrets. He pulled files that mapped every camera and patrol route in South Ridge and found a folder called Operation Redline, tying weapons shipments and fake intel directly to Holloway's companies. The mission that supposedly killed my son was on that list, and that folded flag on my shelf suddenly looked like part of somebody's business plan. After that, it didn't stay just our problem. At the next town council meeting, Jalen marched Brandon in wearing cuffs and sat him under a banner that said, "Police protect the community." He plugged his phone into the projector and hit play. The room watched Brandon on that warehouse video, yanking my head back, heard him spit. "Who told you to stick your nose in white folks' business?" Saw my swollen face and tied hands. People in the front row gasped. Folks from South Ridge lining the back wall just nodded like finally there it is where you can't look away. Brandon started shouting that he was just following orders. Jalen tugged on the chain and said loud enough for every mic, "Then say whose orders. Let them hear the name." Under those lights, with all those eyes on him, Brandon named Holloway out loud. A document about the South Ridge surveillance project got read into the record, and suddenly no one could pretend this was one officer having a bad night. Federal investigators came next. The files Jalen pulled laid out weapons disguised as farm equipment emails between Holloway and Chief Mills in Operation Redline, with Holloway's name stamped all over it. Soon I was in a hearing room miles from home, hands shaking on a polished table, trying to explain to people who never worry about traffic stops what it feels like to live under a lens you can't see. I told them about Maple Street, about the warehouse, about my son walking through a door I thought belonged to a coffin, and I said as steady as I could that truth doesn't die because we talk about it too much. It dies when we're too afraid to name it. In the end, Holloway went to prison for weapons and illegal surveillance. Brandon got years for assault and abuse of power, and Chief Mills lost his badge. Red Willow had to watch itself on the news and admit the hero it praised had used that praise as cover. Justice didn't feel like fireworks to me. It felt like finally setting down a box I'd carried my whole life and realizing my hands were still curled like they were holding it. Yeah, that happened. You'd think that would be the end, lesson learned, story closed, but life doesn't really do clean endings. A few weeks after sentencing, 67.9 crackled to life again, the little light flipping from green to red, and a rough voice said, "Green, I'm still alive, Project Rise Phase 2. Almost at the same time, a black SUV with no plates eased up to the curb outside my house and just sat there, engine running, windows black like a question parked in front of my door. Jalen stood beside me at the window, eyes moving between the truck and that blinking red light, and when I asked if he was sure he wanted to keep going, he said, "If this is Phase 2, Holloway was just the front. I'm not walking away and leaving you under what comes next." So that's where I am now, an old man with scars, a son the government tried to erase, a town that finally saw part of its reflection, and a radio on 67.9 still blinking in the dark. And I want to ask you, if you'd been tied to that chair or sitting in that council hall or holding those files in that hearing room, what would you have done? Would you have spoken sooner, believed the people, everyone else called dramatic, pushed harder when folks said, "That's just how it is"? Or would you have stayed quiet like I did on Maple Street? Tell me in the comments what you think justice really looks like, whether you believe systems like this can change or just get better at hiding. And if you've got a story from your own town where somebody finally named the truth out loud, share it, because the more of these we drag into the light, the harder it gets for anybody to pretend they never heard the signal. And listen, maybe you've never had a gun pointed at you in a warehouse or watched your kid walk through a door you thought the world had slammed shut, but you still know that feeling of being talked over, written off, treated like your side of the story is just noise. You know what I mean? That moment when somebody with power shrugs and acts like what happened to you is just procedure or policy, like pain becomes smaller if they call it by a different name. If you've been there, if you've seen a neighbor, a coworker, a student, anybody get ground down like that, I want you to put it in words down there too, because somebody scrolling through those comments might finally realize they're not crazy and they're not alone. That's how this stuff changes in real life. Not all at once, not because of one courtroom or one hearing, but because enough people start saying out loud what used to only live in the static.